Welcome back to my YouTube channel. My guest today is Professor Wendy Fonarow, who's a professor of anthropology at Glendale College. And together with Wendy today, we'll talk about Dia de los Muertos, that is the Mexican festivity that is upcoming in a few days. Thanks for your time, Wendy. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, before we start talking about Dia de los Muertos, maybe you can introduce yourself, say something about your background, and introduce yourself to my viewers if you want.
Sure, I'd love to. I began my research initially on Halloween practices in the early 1990s. I did my master's on contemporary Halloween in Southern California, and I continued to study that. But as time went on, I was interested in other rituals that portray the relationship between the living and the dead. And being in Southern California, where we have a large Mexican-American community, I got very interested in Dias de los Muertos. And I've been studying that for over 15 years now, along with Halloween. And I've actually gone to Mexico on 3 different Dias de los Muertos and always participate in the events that we have here in Southern California.
Well, we forgot to mention that this is the second time you're my guest because, 2 years ago, we made a similar video and we talked about Halloween. So I definitely recommend my viewers to go check that out too, because that was outstanding.
Yeah, interestingly, because I've spent 30 years on Halloween, I still feel relatively like a novice for Day of the Dead, even though I've been studying it for 15 years.
Okay. Well, wow. Interesting. That's a peculiar angle, to say the least. Okay, so Dia de los Muertos is not the Mexican version of Halloween because it's actually a mashup of pre-Columbian cultures and the Catholic religion brought by the Spanish people after the discovery of America. Can you explain us the history of this festivity in a nutshell and how this mashup started?
So one of the first things I'll say is this is actually what anthropology brings to the table for this discussion, because the story of syncretism, I would say, is the sacred narrative for Dias de los Muertos. When you look at historians or contemporary scholars looking at Day of the Dead, it always begins with that statement that it's a blending of these pre-Columbian and then Spanish Catholic traditions. And when you look at the history, the amount that is pre-Columbian is relatively muted. And what we find there is amplified as people try and reconstruct the history from a contemporary point of view. So as an anthropologist, what's really important in the modern sense is that people see that Day of the Dead is the opportunity to recognize those pre-Columbian components. So the history of Day of the Dead is very much the history of Mexico itself, where you had this decimation of the indigenous population in a demographic catastrophe that is probably unknown otherwise in human history. And the amount of pre-Columbian or indigenous influences into the contemporary practices were relatively muted. And so when people try and understand what's going on now, it's about teasing out these various components and trying to amplify them. And it's one of the reasons why in contemporary practices, you'll often see Aztec dancers or Yaqui, which is one of the indigenous groups of what is now Mexico. The Yaqui dancers with the deer antlers, those dances are now part of celebrations. So the majority of Dias de los Muertos is coming from Southern Europe and Catholicism, but it's meeting with the indigenous experience. And that means it's an experience of death and decimation and a need to remember what came before. So the issue of memory is incredibly important. So the indigenous part isn't so much that these practices themselves were pre-Columbian, but it's the experience of the pre-Columbian population in relationship to colonialism that produced Dia de los Muertos.
Well, the most recognizable icon of Dia de los Muertos is the skulls. What is the role of skulls? Because we see skulls everywhere. I mean, if I Google Dia de los Muertos, I'm going to find skulls everywhere, even people masquerading as skulls. Can you explain us what's the role of this?
So it is a celebration of the dead, and the Aztec celebration of the dead was actually in late summer, not in autumn. And well, the role of the dead, it's that the skull you do find in Aztec art, but when you're seeing it on art or in the ritual context, the skulls are there in a very fearsome way. So you'll see skull racks. And when you're looking at the literature of talking about things like ritual sacrifice, it's very much presented as the skulls were part of the intimidation and consolidation of power amongst the Aztecs. So what's interesting with the skull is that it isn't until around the 1750s that you start seeing the skull at least written about in literature in Mexico in this more contemporary style of the whimsical, challenging of social norms, playful version of the skull. But you very much see that with medieval art and in the dance macabre. So it's thought that the blending that people talk about, they are looking at the image of the skull that's coming from Southern Europe, but it's meeting the sensibilities of this experience of how do you deal with the grief, the agony, the transformation that happened in what we now call Mexico. So the contemporary role of the skull is severalfold. One of them is it's about mocking in some ways the vanities of the living. That's why the skulls themselves are shown doing the things that humans do. So you'll see little retablos with calacas, which are the little skeleton figures, and they'll be doing things like making bread, or you'll have a doctor doing surgery, and it's a little skeleton that's doing that. And so you see these retablos of skeletons doing all the things that humans do. And in some ways, what this is showing is that because we will all look this way at some point, it's a way of mocking the vanities of the living and all the different ways we separate each other. So the rich from the poor, male versus female, rural versus urban, all of those things, we are all equal in the end. And so the skull does this tremendous job of showing the duality of life and death, but as well that death is a great equalizer and that it's something that happens to everyone. And it's one of the reasons why the skull makeup that's sometimes called Katrina makeup, calling it Katrina comes from the history of the skull in its contemporary usage. But if you think about a live human with the skull paint on, it's showing both life and death at the same time. And it's also one of the reasons why some of the styles of the Katrina makeup is to have half your face painted. So one half looks living and the other half looks like this sort of whimsical stylized skull. And sometimes it's just the top versus bottom half. So this idea of presenting life and death simultaneously is there.
Well, another thing we can see if we Google, for instance, Dia de los Muertos, is altars that people set up in their houses. What do they put on these altars and what are they for?
So it turns out there's a huge variety according to geographic areas for altars. There are two things. For an altar itself, you need to have at least one level. Most altars will have 3 levels or 7 levels. And depending on that, they would mean different things. So a 3-level altar is meant to mean sky, earth, and the underworld. If it's 7 levels, most of the time people say that those are the steps to heaven. It's interesting because the Aztec beliefs around the afterworld was this journey to Mitlan, and that was a journey that had nine phases. So the altar is again showing that Catholic imprint. But what is essential on all altars is that you need to have candles and you need to have marigold flowers. And those marigold flowers are called cempasúchil. And they're that beautiful orangey gold color, almost the same color that you find in monarch butterflies. And the aroma of the marigold is very strong. And it's thought that those marigold, the marigold flowers and the petals from it will lead the dead back to you. And the marigold was really important in Aztec agriculture because the strong scent of the marigold worked as an insecticide. So it also means that when you have food on your altar, you very rarely get flies or other insects because this strong smell is keeping the insects away. It's thought that the candles represent fire. So for some altars that are more elaborate, you have symbols of fire, air, water, and earth. So the candles would be for fire. It's thought to light the way. Most altars will have a glass of water because the dead coming back from Mitlan, it takes 4 years to get there. So it's amazing that they can come back in a night or two and then go back. But it's thought that when they arrive, they're thirsty. There are also foods that are on the altar, and those are also to nourish the dead who are returning. For air, you have, sorry, that's my dog.
Your dog, no problem.
Yeah, for air, you have papel picado, and what that is are tissue papers that have been imprinted, and the cutouts tend to be things based on Jose Guadalupe Posado's skeletons. The majority of the skeleton iconography that you see contemporarily comes from his work from the middle to late 1800s. That is something that developed in the newspaper trade, and also is this important history in the reframing of the meaning of the skull over time. So if we have a moment, I'll go back to Posado, but the papel picada, the style of cutting out, this was one of the pre-Columbian elements, because for the Aztecs they had a technique of doing basically bark cutting to make what would be like banners. So on most altars you'll see the papel picado above the altar and on the altar itself, decorating it. So we have water, fire, air, and the last would be earth, which means that you would have food on the altar. And we find the food in a couple different forms. There are certain standard items. The most important standard item is pan de muerto, which is like dead bread for the dead. And what that's made of is also super significant. But in addition to the bread for the dead, you will have favored items of your dead relatives, because everything about Day of the Dead is about memory and reunion and reuniting. So the entire sentiment is of welcome and beckoning. So you want the smells to be something that call the dead. There's also Copal incense will often be used on altars, and that's another really strong smell that's thought to attract the dead. But those food items, people will put some of the favorite foods of the departed to entice them back. And most of those foods will be things that are really labor intensive, things like mole or tamales. These are dishes that are really, really difficult and time consuming to make. And in making food for someone who has passed, it's a way that even in the preparations that you get to feel like they are still with us. Because in the same way when they were alive, that you would take the time to hand make mole or take the time at the holidays to make tamales. For the living, there is something really deeply meaningful and pleasurable in putting that labor in to welcome back the dead. And it's thought that during the Days of the Dead, that they will partake of that, that they enjoy the aroma, and that the food afterwards, some of the flavor has gone because the dead have partaken in what has been put on the altar for them.
So far we talked about like things that they set up, but what is the actual celebration? Like, since they prepare food, I expect like big gatherings, such as on Christmas Day, where you have all the family gathering and eating together. Does anything of the sort happen, or is the celebration totally different?
So it's really varied according to districts. In many ways, what most people in Mexico and probably around the world envision is what we find in some of the more rural areas. So what you would find in the rural areas around Oaxaca or the rural areas in Michoacan. And in those areas, the cities would be the areas where you have preparations, and altars are placed in people's houses, and doors are open so people can visit other people's houses. Businesses will have altars in them, as well as in some of the public areas. But on the night itself, in these rural areas, people will go to the cemeteries and clean and decorate the cemetery areas, the grave areas, and they will be covered with the marigolds. In Sensunsan, which is in Michoacan, they'll have beautiful, elaborate arches covered with marigolds, and you'll have along them, you'll have pan de muerto, the bread of the dead, hung from them. And people will basically spend vigil all night. In other areas, like in San Luis Potosi, which is where I went last year, almost nothing happens in the cemeteries at night. In the days leading up to the Day of the Dead, people will go to the cemeteries and clean and decorate the graveyards, the graves of their relatives. And there'll be music and eating during the day. As a visitor there, you will be offered food, because the fact that you're coming is seen as that you also want to pay respects. It's something that even as an outsider, you feel very, very welcome in. But in that district, the types of celebrations are primarily in the little hamlet centers. What you'll have there are Katrina contests, which are getting dressed up in the Calavera makeup and in the style of the figure that is the Katrina, that originates with Posada, the printmaker, and then gets reframed by Diego Rivera. And you'll have people dress in these costumes, and there will be contests for who is, it's not so much the most beautiful, but almost like the one that captures the spirit of the Katrina most accurately. And there's also Compasaro, there are also carnival dancers. Sorry.
No problem.
There are also carnival dancers. They're also carnival dancers, and you've got sort of each village or region or town will have their own troupe. Sometimes they're young people, sometimes they're members of the community of all ages, and that will be done like a parade. So I saw both, where you had the Katrina contest mixed in with the dancing competition, and then in other areas it was all like a parade, and primarily the dancers who then would dance through the local city, and they're wearing masquerade, and many of those masks are made out of wood, and they're depicting traditional roles in Mexican agrarian society. So you'll have like peasant women, peasant men, older people, the infirmed, so there'll even be masks displaying disability. And then there's usually like angels as well as a devil. But you get the array of these masks and then dancers. And I'm amazed by how much diversity there is in practices, but how much Oaxaca and Michoacan have captured the world's imagination as the way of doing Dias de los Muertos. In Mexico City, you primarily get these private spaces in homes, but also in plazas, these big public altars. And those public altars are very much about social critique. So one of the years that I went to Mexico City, they were commemorating these protests by students, where the police responded by killing students and professors. And it's in the big square in downtown, where you had altar after altar commemorating what had happened to those students. And one of the reasons for that is that in a big city like Mexico City, ordinary citizens cannot afford to bury their dead. They are going to need to bury their dead either far away in like home communities where they have relatives, or they even need to do cremation. So because of that, in Mexico City, very, very little happens in graveyards.
Okay, this was unexpected, because you expect the capital city to be a place where the festivity is more important, but actually it's somehow different. I was also wondering, from outside and afar, it seems like Dia de los Muertos is a very important piece of the Mexican culture. So I was wondering, how important is it? Like, can it compare with Christmas and Easter in terms of importance?
Yeah, I think that I get a slightly colored version because people know that I'm really interested in Day of the Dead. But there are areas where the amount of effort and investment in Day of the Dead is enormous. And so it is incredibly important in the liturgical calendar. And a number of scholars suggest that it is one of the most elaborately celebrated of all the rituals. So I would say it rivals, but with the amount of diversity, I would feel like I'd need to be a scholar of Mexico to answer that really in an adequate fashion. But it is definitely very, very important. And in the weeks running up to the event, you will find all over shops decorated in the Day of the Dead iconography. And it's the colors as well of those banners. The banners tend to be pink, purple, red, green, sometimes white. And when people see those colors, they know autumn is coming. So it's one of those markers of time that's very, very important. And in shops, you have all of the bakeries are selling the bread of the dead. again, in some districts, the bread of the dead isn't that important, but I've touched on that being significant. And there are a couple things about the bread of the dead, as well as something else that is often on the altars, but it's also in the run-up to Day of the Dead, is that you will find throughout market stalls these sugar skulls, these sugar calaveras that are made of alfanique, which is granulated sugar in a paste. It's a Mexican adaptation of marzipan, and it's used to make these skulls. And what people will do is that with small skulls, there's a place on the forehead to put people's names. So small ones you give to children. The sort of normal sized ones you give to your adult friends. And then very, very large ones are to go on family altars, and they will have the name of the family on it. So it would be like Fonarow or Gonzalez. That would be on your family altar. And the ingredient of sugar, this was probably the first thing that got me really interested in studying Day of the Dead, because historically, sugar, a cash crop, but as well, a really rare item. And I was thinking, how in the world did this expensive item become the thing that is the plaything of Day of the Dead, that you're using for the sugar skulls, that you are having little toys and trinkets made out of it? So skeletons will be like, you'll have a little coffin with the skeleton where you pull on the string and it rises up. And even the depiction of that is something that you found in the 1750s, of talking about these little toys and trinkets in the design of the dead. And sugar and sugarcane is not native to the New World. It's a cash crop that was brought over as part of the Columbia Exchange. And it turns out that the sugar itself you had sugar plantations in Mexico. So this really not this ingredient that was not part of the Mexican diet. When you have mole, you have chocolate in it, but it was not chocolate with sugar. Chocolate was a savory dish, and the early chocolate milk was also, the chocolate drinks were made without sugar. So you've got the colonial cash crop in the shape of a skull, which is very much an image of what happened with the diseases that were brought by the Spaniards that created this demographic collapse and the whole scale, not just the collapse of the Aztec society, but the decimation of the indigenous population. So for the bread of the dead, it's also a bread made out of wheat. It's not made from corn. And wheat is another, again, European crop. So the foods that you're having on Day of the Dead are the sugar that is the European that was used on plantations, as well as the wheat. So the images that you find for Day of the Dead are very much the European coming over and producing death for the indigenous. And what you get over time is this sort of reappropriation of the pre-Columbian within this event. So by saying that the pre-Columbian or the indigenous wasn't there at the beginning, it is very much there in the present. So the contemporary festivities are very much a blend, but the idea of beckoning the dead to come back, the idea of having food offerings on an altar, there just really is not a lot of historic evidence that those were pre-Columbian practices or Aztec practices.
How long are the celebrations? Is it just one day, or does it stretch like to the whole month?
The preparations are at least a month long. So even 6 weeks in advance, you'll start seeing the signs of Day of the Dead. And again, you'll see these drawings or etchings or cutouts that evoke the work of Posada, really the key figure who's seen as revitalizing the skull as an image of cultural critique, and it becomes associated with Dias de los Muertos. The days themselves are for, you've got some of the celebrations begin even on what would be All Hallows Eve, so on Halloween, but the majority of the celebrations are on November 1st through November 3rd. So some places, the big events are on the evening of November 1st, and in other places, the big events are on the evening of November 2nd. In Pátzcuaro, which is the location that was chosen for Disney's Coco. So that Disney's Coco is based on an actual location, an actual cemetery that I was lucky enough to visit. When I saw the film, I instantly recognized the location of that particular cemetery. And for them, the big event, the big celebration is on the evening of November 1st into November 2nd. But again, depending on where you are, which of those days will be part of it, or how long you'll be in doing the cemetery vigil if you're in one of the districts that do that. So it lasts basically 2 days, but the preparations are all part of the event. So people will be gifting sugar skulls, visiting each other. Outside of Mexico City is an area called Mixquic, and a lot of people in Mexico City will visit the cemetery in that area in advance of Day of the Dead. So in the days running up to it, and you will have events there. So a little bit like the industrial calendar has made it so that sometimes the celebrations even precede it. So like the weekend days will often have a lot of those festivities. And then in Mexico City, a relatively recent invention is the parade for Day of the Dead. And that tends to be done on the weekend, either before or 2 weeks before Day of the Dead. And I say that's a recent invention because it was initially invented for the film Spectre. So the filmmakers decided to portray a parade in Mexico City. And the following year, the tourism board in Mexico decided to do a parade. And initially there was a certain amount of skepticism around it. But by the following year, there was the earthquake in Puebla. And there was so much outrage at the corruption, at the governmental corruption, that Day of the Dead as this vehicle to critique and skewer the powerful and the elite, and again, human vanities and greed and avarice, meant that the parade was able to express that critique about what happened in Puebla, and that sort of solidified it as being legitimate with the population. So last year, the parade is still going, even though it's less than 10 years old.
I was wondering, is Dia de los Muertos celebrated the same way also in adjacent countries? Because what I'm thinking here is they speak the same language, which is Spanish. Of course, I'm talking about the South. And in that kind of context, probably the cultures can like cross the border. So do we have Dia de los Muertos in other countries?
So you get, because it is a Catholic celebration, not in the manifestation of the way it's done in Mexico. Because again, the unique part in Mexico has to do with this role of sugar being amplified. But you do find it in other places within Latin America. There are celebrations in Peru, particularly amongst the Amara population. That one, you don't get the playful skulls. You actually have the use of real skulls in many of the celebrations. They are decorated, they're brought to churches. That is, it's not, it's, the church isn't necessarily endorsing it, but the local churches embrace it. In Guatemala, you do also have offerings at the grave. That's done usually with like a type of like sort of purple gruel porridge. It's not as elaborate, but the fact that you find celebrations that are related throughout Latin America again suggests that strong influence of Spanish Catholicism in the event. But in some of the things that make Mexico unique are their unique history and the important role of remembering and reanimating and reincorporating Aztec traditions is part of what makes it so magnificent.
Well, we have a big misconception here in Italy, especially among old school Italians, according to which anything that is not part of our tradition is anti-Christian. Therefore, most of the old school Italians hate Halloween for this reason. And of course, they hate mashup of cultures such as Dia de los Muertos. And of course, they don't like seeing skulls. So can we rule out once and for all that this celebration is somehow anti-Christian and overshadowing the Christian tradition?
I mean, there's still mass held. Part of your celebration is mass. On the 7 levels of the altar, the very top of the altar will have images of saints and images of the Virgin Mary. So it is definitely conceived of within Mexico as being part of a Catholic observance. But the issue there would be saying, we don't want anything that doesn't look Italian in your ritual. And it seems to me that that's a little bit unreasonable to think that everyone should look just your way.
It is.
And I think part of it has to do with, when I hear that, I hear so much of what sounds to me Protestant, the idea of anything foreign being problematic. Because I think another part of the genuine gift of Dias de los Muertos is how it's able to constantly be innovative in ways that are genuinely powerful, as long as it meets that internal logic of welcoming home your ancestors and your dead to celebrate. What I would add about it is that I could imagine that there's a little bit of Italian skepticism, because the earliest acknowledgement that we have for All Souls was actually in France. And that was in the 10th century. And it doesn't get added, All Souls does not get added to the liturgical calendar until 300 years later. So it seems like it was a need of the people that the church eventually acknowledged and said, yes, this is, we celebrate the saints, and then we celebrate all of the souls. But of all those souls, it's actually all the souls who are part of the church. So it isn't all of the dead, but it is all of the faithful deceased. So you needed to, that was what the acknowledgement was. So know that even in that, the dead that you're acknowledging within the ideology is that you're acknowledging the dead that are part of the Catholic tradition. However, in contemporary practices, all of whatever of your dead ancestors or loved ones are welcome. There are several unofficial days in the run up to Day of the Dead. Like today is the unofficial day that you can acknowledge pets. So people will do altars of their pets. Now, while today is the official day of that, you will also see pets acknowledged on Day of the Dead. And dogs are particularly important for Day of the Dead because the Xolo, which is
Time to stretch, go for a walk, or call a friend.
I don't know if you heard that.
Yes, I did.
I really need to turn that off. The Sholo was a companion animal to escort you through those levels of getting to Midlan, what took you 4 years. So the very first phase of death is crossing this river, and your companion dog, your Sholo, would meet you and then escort you the rest of the way. And these were really arduous phases. So that the next phase was getting through a mountain that had been sort of blended together. The next phase was climbing a mountain of obsidian rock. So you can imagine how sharp that was. There's another phase where the wind is so sharp that it actually cleans the flesh from your bones. And in that sense, this is one of the areas where you can start seeing maybe the image of the skull and the skeleton. You can see a pre-Columbian element to it, an Aztec element. So
Go ahead.
So did we dissuade that?
Yeah, I hope so, and I'll do my part in explaining that to people. But of course, the old school Catholics don't want to listen, and they don't listen. I specifically specified that it's old school people because, of course, young people understand that there's nothing anti-Christian in celebrating it a different way.
Yeah. So.
Well, many thanks for your very interesting explanations. I think that we covered a topic that is totally unknown in Italy because people know something about Halloween, and you gave a very precious explanations 2 years ago to explain all the context and the history of it. And today we covered something that specifically in Italy, I would say no one knows. So I think that this is a good point to start learning about this.
And I would even say that the Disney film Coco does a pretty good job depicting modern Day of the Dead. It's actually beloved in Mexico. And in the years since it's come out, I see children dressed as the main character, Miguel, in the Calavera style makeup. So,
I haven't watched it. I'll check it out. Thanks for your suggestion. Maybe this weekend. So this is the best time in the year to watch it.
Yeah. And it's interesting. It's such a big event that even in this conversation, there are so many things that I only mentioned but wasn't able to explain, like Posada and how Diego Rivera reframes the critique of the elegant woman that you find from Posada and turns her into the emblem of Dias de los Muertos. So there is so much, it is such a rich celebration. So it isn't just the varieties in the various places, but it's so meaningful to the culture. And it is a way of claiming the complicated and complex history of Mexico, which is one where you have the decimation of an indigenous population and the legitimate heirs of this illegitimate past.
Thanks for adding this. Yes, this is a very important detail to add. And of course, this is just a starting point. This is the best we can do in this short amount of time. But of course, there's much more to say about this topic and about all other festivities that we can try to investigate and understand over the years. Thanks again, Wendy, for your very precious explanations and for your time. Thanks everybody else for watching this, and see you all next time. Bye-bye.